Welcome back to Space Universe. Today we are covering a story that happened just yesterday. A story that affected millions of ordinary Americans overnight. A story about an airline that for 34 years made flying possible for people who could never afford it. And then in the early hours of Saturday, May 2, 2026, it simply stopped. Every yellow plane grounded. Every flight cancelled. Every employee out of a job. Thousands of passengers stranded at airports across America with nowhere to go. This is the complete and documented story of Spirit Airlines. How it started. How it changed American aviation forever. And how a chain of events that began years ago finally brought it to its end. To understand Spirit Airlines, you first need to understand where it came from, because almost nobody knows the real origin story. Spirit did not begin as an airline at all. The company started in 1964 as Clipper Trucking Company in Michigan. A trucking company. In 1980, an entrepreneur named Ned Homfeld transformed that company into Charter One Airlines, operating out of Macomb County, Michigan. It was a charter tour operator. It flew leisure travelers to places like Atlantic City, Las Vegas, and the Bahamas. Budget vacation packages for working-class Midwesterners who wanted a cheap holiday. Nothing about those early flights suggested that this small Michigan charter company would one day reshape the entire American aviation industry. On May 29, 1992, the carrier rebranded as Spirit Airlines and began scheduled service from Detroit to Atlantic City. The yellow branding. The stripped-back approach. The focus on price above everything else. The identity of the airline that millions of Americans would come to know was taking shape. But the real transformation came in 2007. That was the year Spirit made a decision that changed everything. Under CEO Ben Baldanza, the airline formally adopted what it called the ultra-low-cost carrier model. The concept was simple and radical at the same time. Strip the base fare down to almost nothing. Charge separately for everything else. Want to bring a carry-on bag onto the plane? Pay extra. Want to choose your seat? Pay extra. Want a drink of water? Pay extra. Want to print your boarding pass at the airport instead of online? Pay extra. The base fare was genuinely cheap. Sometimes absurdly cheap. But by the time you added everything you actually needed for a real trip, the total cost was often closer to what other airlines charged anyway. Spirit pioneered the carry-on bag fee in 2010, becoming the first airline in the United States to charge passengers for bringing a bag into the cabin. The public reaction was furious. Passengers felt tricked. Spirit became the most complained about airline in America. News segments ran stories about travelers discovering at the gate that their free carry-on would now cost them $80. Customer satisfaction surveys consistently ranked Spirit at or near the bottom of every list. The airline became a punchline. A symbol of corporate greed dressed up as consumer savings. Social media made it worse. Every bad Spirit experience became a viral post. Every extra fee became a meme. And yet Spirit kept growing. Because here is the thing that the critics and the jokes missed. For a very specific group of Americans, Spirit was not a punchline. It was a lifeline. There are millions of people in this country for whom a $400 round-trip ticket is simply not possible. Spirit was offering flights for $40. For $60. For prices that made flying a real option for families and workers and students who had never flown before in their lives. Spirit forced legacy carriers to rethink their pricing strategies and adopt basic economy products of their own, validating Spirit's pricing logic even as competition compressed some fare spreads. In other words, Spirit Airlines changed how every major airline in America priced its tickets. Delta, American, United, Southwest, they all introduced basic economy stripped-down fare classes specifically because Spirit proved there was a massive market of price-sensitive travelers who would accept fewer amenities for a lower price. Spirit did not just build an airline. It reshaped the entire industry. By 2023, Spirit was the 7th largest passenger carrier in North America and the largest ultra-low-cost carrier on the continent. It operated over 900 daily routes across the United States, Latin America, and the Caribbean. Its bright yellow planes were everywhere. The joke airline that everyone mocked had quietly become one of the biggest carriers in North America. But underneath the growth, a set of structural problems were building that would eventually become impossible to escape. The first major blow came from an unexpected direction. In 2022, JetBlue made an offer to buy Spirit Airlines for $3.8 billion. On paper, the deal made sense. Spirit needed financial stability and a path forward. JetBlue needed to grow. Together they would have become the fifth largest airline in the United States. Spirit's shareholders voted to accept the deal. But the United States Department of Justice under the Biden administration filed an antitrust lawsuit to block the merger. The DOJ argued that a JetBlue acquisition of Spirit would remove the cheapest carrier from dozens of markets and ultimately result in higher prices for the budget traveler Spirit was designed to serve. In January 2024, a federal judge sided with the DOJ and blocked the merger, ruling that it would reduce competition and hurt low-income travelers who depended on Spirit's ultra-cheap fares. The decision destroyed Spirit's future almost immediately. The airline had spent nearly 2 years in acquisition limbo. During those 2 years it had burned through cash. It had not been able to make the investments it needed. It had lost pilots and staff to other carriers. And now the merger was dead. Spirit was on its own with no clear path forward and a balance sheet that was already showing serious stress. The blocked JetBlue merger left Spirit with roughly $1.1 billion of debt maturing in 2025 and 2026, forcing enormous strategic and financing pressure. Then came another problem Spirit could not control. Pratt & Whitney GTF engine recalls grounded dozens of Spirit's newer A320neo aircraft in 2024 and 2025, cutting available seat miles, increasing unit costs and disrupting schedules during peak travel seasons. These were the newest, most fuel-efficient aircraft in Spirit's fleet. Having them grounded meant Spirit had to operate with fewer planes at higher cost precisely when it most needed efficiency. In November 2024, Spirit filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection for the first time. The company blamed mounting losses, the failed merger, increasing debt, and high competition. Chapter 11 bankruptcy is not necessarily the end of a company. It is a legal process that allows a business to restructure its debts under court supervision while continuing to operate. Spirit's plan was to emerge from bankruptcy as a leaner, more competitive airline. It sold older aircraft. It reduced its workforce. It cut routes. In March 2025, Spirit emerged from Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection after finalizing its debt restructuring. It looked like survival was possible. It was not. In August 2025, Spirit announced that it was running out of cash and may not be able to stay in business for another year. On August 29, 2025, Spirit filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy for the second time in less than a year. The second bankruptcy was a clear signal to the industry and to investors that Spirit's problems were not just financial. They were structural. The ultra-low-cost model that had made Spirit famous was no longer delivering the cost advantage it once had. Fuel prices had risen. Labor costs had risen. Competition had intensified. Other carriers had copied Spirit's playbook. And Spirit no longer had the cost edge that its entire business model depended on. And then came the final blow. Something completely outside Spirit's control. In February 2026, the United States and Israel attacked Iran. The result was a war that sent jet fuel costs doubling in some markets almost overnight. For any airline, fuel is the largest single operating expense. For Spirit, whose entire model was built around having the lowest possible costs, a doubling of fuel prices was catastrophic. Every flight that was already barely profitable became a money-losing operation. The path to financial recovery that Spirit's restructuring plan had assumed was built on fuel prices that no longer existed. In the final week, Spirit's leadership turned to the Trump administration for help. The airline asked for a $500 million government bailout. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick got involved in the negotiations personally. President Trump publicly signaled his approval of the idea, saying he wanted to save the jobs. But the deal required Spirit's bondholders to agree to terms that would have put the federal government ahead of their own claims and given the government up to a 90% stake in the airline. The bondholders rejected it. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick called Spirit CEO Dave Davis to tell him there was no deal and that bondholders and the government were far from an agreement. The end came in the early hours of Saturday, May 2, 2026. In a message to flight attendants, the Association of Flight Attendants said, "We are delivering the hardest news of our lives that Spirit will cease operations at 3 a.m. Eastern Time on May 2, 2026. When passengers opened the Spirit Airlines app that morning, they saw a single message. "We regret to inform you that all Spirit Airlines flights have been cancelled effective immediately." Why? The airline said it flew more than 50,000 people the day leading up to its collapse. Those were the last passengers Spirit ever carried. The bright yellow planes went silent at airports across the country. Check-in kiosks displayed operational update messages. Departure boards at LaGuardia showed nothing but cancelled Spirit flights. One woman and her elderly mother arrived at the airport for a flight to Charlotte for a family funeral and had not received any notifications about their cancelled flight. Another traveler told CNN she had arrived at LaGuardia expecting to fly to Florida for Mother's Day and only found out Spirit had shut down when she arrived at the terminal. Some 17,000 direct and indirect employees lost their jobs as a result of the collapse, including 14,000 Spirit employees and thousands of contractors and other people whose livelihoods depended on the airline. Pilots who had joined the company just a few years earlier received the news by email from the chief pilot. Flight attendants who had spent years building their careers at Spirit were suddenly without income, healthcare, or any certainty about what came next. Spirit's shutdown marks the first time in 25 years that a major U.S. airline has gone out of business due to financial trouble. The last time something comparable happened was the collapse of Midway Airlines in 2001 in the weeks after September 11. Spirit had survived a pandemic, an engine crisis, 2 bankruptcies, a failed merger, and years of public mockery. In the end, it was a combination of a court ruling, a war, and the price of jet fuel that brought it down. The impact will not stop with Spirit's employees. An average of 300 flights and 60,000 potential passengers a day in just the coming month alone will be affected by Spirit's collapse. The disappearance of Spirit from the market means the disappearance of the cheapest fares in dozens of American cities. The budget travelers Spirit was built to serve will now have to pay more to fly. Or they will simply not fly. The communities Spirit served, many of them smaller cities and leisure destinations that major carriers underserve, will lose direct connections. The irony of the DOJ blocking the JetBlue merger to protect budget travelers is not lost on anyone. Those same travelers now have no Spirit to fly at all. Dave Davis, the CEO of Spirit, released a statement saying that for more than 30 years Spirit Airlines played a pioneering role in making travel more accessible and bringing people together while driving affordability across the industry. He thanked the Trump administration for their efforts to save the airline. The Trump administration's Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy held a press conference at Newark Airport saying that major carriers were capping fares for stranded Spirit passengers at around $200 and creating dedicated job portals for Spirit employees. United Airlines, Delta, American Airlines, and Southwest all announced measures to help. But for the 17,000 workers who woke up that morning without a job, $200 capped fares were not the point. Spirit Airlines began as a trucking company in Michigan in 1964. It became a charter operator flying gamblers to Atlantic City. It reinvented itself as the most hated and most used budget airline in America. It changed how every major carrier in this country priced its tickets. It made flying possible for millions of Americans who had never flown before. And in the early hours of a Saturday morning in May 2026, after 34 years of yellow planes and cheap fares and endless complaints and genuine democratization of air travel, it simply stopped. The planes are on the ground. The terminals are quiet. And the Americans who could only afford to fly on Spirit are left to figure out what comes next. If this video gave you something, hit the like button right now. Subscribe to Space Universe because every week we cover the real stories behind the events that are shaping the world right now. I will see you in the next one. Until then, keep asking questions.